Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Anne-Marie O'Dwyer. I'm one of the co-directors of Neurodiversity in Education, and today I am recording a session on why accommodating neurodivergent teachers benefits all. And this session really is for all levels of management in education. Many of my references are to further education because that's my background, and I'm going to talk a little bit about do a little introduction about myself shortly. And the session today really is just thinking about how it benefits all in terms of the workforce as a whole, and particularly considerations for the neurodivergent workforce. But also in terms as an organisation, to ensure that it's compliant in terms of the Equality Act, but we go beyond that. So this is really what this session is about. So it's a kind of, I use that term benefits all in the broadest sense, and ultimately if you have a supported workforce, that's going to have positive effects for learners as well. So this is about looking at institutional and cultural shift in our thinking. Okay, so just a little bit about myself, or I thought I'd start off talking a little bit about me. So my this little video image will obstruct some of the slides, but don't worry because the slides will be included, so you can, go through them as I'm doing the presentation, or you can look at them later. So my name is Anne-Marie O'Dwyer. My pronouns are she and her. I identify as neurodivergent. I was diagnosed as dyslexic and dyspraxic as an adult. I've recently been screened for autism and ADHD. And there are clear indicators of, in terms of supporting going for a full diagnosis, but I'm not sure that I will pursue that. I identify, as I said, in terms of neurodivergent. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that term means in a second. I'm a neurodivergent advocate and academic. And my research area is around education policy and practice, neurodiversity and the experience and practice of neurodivergent teachers. So I would encourage you to have a look at the little insight piece presentation that I've also done as part of the Neurodiversity in Education conference. So that will be released at some point this week if it hasn't already. And I like to relax by pushing myself in terms of a sensory overload by going into the sea. I'm very fortunate to live by the coast, so I live in St Leonard's. So you will often find me in the sea in all weathers. So I'm the co-founder, joint co-founder of the support group for neurodivergent educational professionals, alongside the brilliant Beth Thomas and Annie Campbell. So we will be running a support session during neurodiversity in education week during the conference. It will be on the Thursday, which I believe is the 3rd of October, and it will be at 7 p.m. So the details are on the conference website, so please do have a look at that. And those sessions run once a month, and there's more details about how you can join that on the Neurodiversity in Education conference site. I'm also the founder of Neurodivergent Insider, and this is a guidance consultancy service for the education sector to assist in terms of developing neuro-inclusive work practices, policy and practice. So the reason I called it neurodivergent insiders, one, being neurodivergent and being an insider in terms of knowing and understand the context of working in education, which can be quite different to working in other environments, which I also have done. And so some of what would be classed as reasonable adjustments in the context of an office is very different in the context of education. So I'll talk a little bit about that later on. And so I've published articles. I write a regular blog as well on my website, and I have my published PhD as well, looking at raising awareness about neurodivergence amongst the teaching workforce. And on my blog, I cover things such as reasonable adjustments, ableism, and there's loads of kind of tips and techniques, so please do have a look at that. Great. I'm going to take a little mouthful before we move on. Okay, so I'm going to start off. Okay, I'm going to jump straight in, looking at this idea of neurocosmopolitanism. Okay, so it's an idea. It's almost like a utopia that Ralph Saravasi and Dr. Nick Walker came about independently. They are both kind of activists and academics in around neurodiversity. And so this idea is really where we want to get to. At the moment, most of this presentation will be about accommodating. And really we need to be thinking about moving beyond accommodation, and for real neurodiversity affirming practice, we should be working in an environment which is already smart, so is already neuro-smart. And that will reduce the need for asking for individual reasonable accommodations that are accommodations that would not only benefit the neurodivergent workforce, but the workforce as a whole. So I'll just give one example. So something like having two monitors. So having two monitors in your workplace and in your workstation at home makes such a difference. So something like that. So you'd have the workplace up. It kind of like lends from universal design practice about setting up a workplace that's already inclusive. And you do that in policy and practice. You do that in the environment. And so this is really what we want to do, is a world where there's no neurocognitive labels. And we really are neuro-inclusive because society is set up to preserve, honour and explore the creative potential of all neurotypes. And as I said, we really want to kind of work in this way of getting to that point where we are completely neuro-smart, and everyone feels included. And one of the key points of that, which I'll talk a little bit later, is then it has knock-on effects in terms of the psychological well-being of all staff. Because if you have policy and practice in place that addresses the potential for, that there may be different neurocognitive ways of processing, then it has a positive effect on the wider workforce, because they'll be able to see as well that this is an inclusive environment. So don't underestimate that it not only benefits the psychological well-being of the staff that the inclusive practice being put in place to address, but just everyone. So this is where we'd like to get to, and we are quite a way off this at the moment. A lot of the time we're not even at the point of compliance, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later. Okay, so I wanted to share just some of the ideas around neurodiversity. So my research and my writing has been heavily influenced by the neurodiversity paradigm, in particular the work by Dr. Nick Walker, and it's change my approach and how I'm looking at things. So I just wanted to go through some of those kind of key concepts and refer to some of those kind of key writers and academics and activists. So what is neurodiversity? You'll see this is something that a term that's used quite frequently now. Now, neurodiversity in its truest sense is a biological perspective and not an approach or a philosophy. So this definition, I'm referring to Walker's definition. There are many others. Neurodiversity is the diversity of minds, and so she talks about body mind, so that encompassing the whole being. The infinite variation, neurocognitive functioning within our species. So what it's stating is that if neurodiversity is a biological fact, why is our structures and systems in place there to really only kind of really accommodate a particular way of thinking and processing, or a particular way of cognitive functioning? So if we put this in the context of education, so if we think about exams and assessment, the way we do assessment, so that benefits a particular cognitive functioning, so it's not going to benefit all. So if we recognize that neurodiversity is a biological fact, why is this not appreciated in the wider societal structures and things that we have in place? So that you've got the neurodiversity biological fact, then from that you have the neurodiversity paradigm, and there are also neurodiversity approaches, and then from that there have been the key terms that have come and concepts that have come out of that kind of those approaches. There's also the neurodiversity movement. So the neurodiversity paradigm, I'll start with that, is really and approaches is a kind of like philosophical foundation. And it sets the kind of the main points of this perspective, so the idea of a normal neurocognitive function is a social construction. And again, if we remember that neurodiversity as a biological fact is saying that there is no normal, then why is everything set up to support that notion of normal? So it rejects the notion of normal. And so you have a neurodiversity paradigm. You also have neurodiversity approaches. Patrick Dwyer wrote an article on this, and he explores some of those different approaches. So like any philosophical that's my dyspraxia sometimes affects my speech, so pronunciation, but we get over that, don't we? So that approaches Patrick Dwyer wrote an article on looking at the different approaches, and what I suppose the unifying point of all of the approaches is that the neurodivergent individuals should be given the autonomy and should be seen as an individual in terms of being in a working environment that allows them to excel themselves. So that's really important when we're thinking about reasonable adjustments, even, which is compliance, that we don't just have one size fits all approach to just reasonable adjustments as well, because really the kind of key thing is what we don't want to do is be putting anything in place which makes the individual feel like they have to fix themselves, which is very much led by the kind of more biomedical approach, which I'll talk about in a second. So you've got the neurodiversity paradigm and approaches. You've also got the neurodiversity movement, and the neurodiversity movement is different from the approaches, and it's kind of like an activism movement. So it's a social justice movement. It's not homogenous, so it's made up of individuals that have other particular and political leanings, but its main point is it sees the lack of recognition as neurodivergence in the same way as, you know, in terms of inequality around gender and ethnicity and sexuality, and so it's a movement which is an activist movement. So you can be very much right from the neurodiversity paradigm, but not be an activist in terms of part of the movement. So that's why it's good to see them as separate. Okay, so with every good philosophical foundation, there is language that is evolved to try and explain the perspectives. So instead of moving away from the kind of biological or biomedical language of condition, disorder and normal, the language of neurodivergent and neurodivergence evolved, and this was put forth by it was actually Cassiana Asimasu. I don't know if apologies, I'm not pronouncing that correctly, who actually came up with the term neurodivergence and neurodivergent. So neurodivergent is simply just, it's a mind that functions from the societal standards of normal. So there's not to say that there is a normal, but it diverges from. Neurodivergence is really, I've summarised it there, it's more complicated than that. So it's a state of being neurodivergent in the fact that neurodivergence appreciates and is an inclusive term. So it includes things such as what they call innate neurodivergence and innate and pervasive neurodivergence, such as autism, dyslexia, but also appreciates where there's been also included in that would be things such as epilepsy, so relation to health. There would also be things that are developed or you know, in terms of any cognitive changes due to medication or through taking recreational drugs. So there are difference in terms of the neurodivergence, but there's still, you know, it's an inclusive term. And also in terms of neurodivergent is really a kind of neutral term. It was to say, to be able to give a language, as I said, that felt more inclusive to those that it relates to. So for myself, instead of saying I've got a specific learning difference, which feels very heavily weighted, and I'll say it's very much like a deficiency, that actually saying I'm neurodivergent feels empowering. So that's really some of the key concepts. So it's good to be aware of those, particularly if you're writing policy around neurodiversity. If you're approaching it from the neurodiversity paradigm in your policy, then it's good to state that. Okay. And it's good to just think about this, that if there's about 15% of the people, I think in the UK, are neurodivergent or may identify as neurodivergent. So that's 1 in 7. So that's why it's really important that we are looking at this. Now, just to summarise a little bit more, I won't go loads into this because I've explained some of it already, but just to give you a sense of the pathology paradigm, which is very much entwined with the biomedical model, which has very much influenced policy and practice up to now, and the idea of a lot of the time reasonable adjustments to get individuals to a point in which they're able to operate the same as everyone else, rather than appreciating their unique ways of cognitively processing information and being. And the neurodiversity paradigm, which is entwined the social model of disability. So I'm just going to I've given a very brief overview there, just to give you an idea of the two. So the pathology paradigm is very much in the perspective of kind of having that kind of cognitive disability difference, and the idea that it's an individual matter in which the individual has to overcome. There is a right normal way of human brains and minds to function, and that is evident, as I said, in terms of the way the workplace is set up. So that could be things like having to work set hours 9 to 5, having to be at your desk, and when it comes to the environment of education, which is different, those two things wouldn't apply. Then if we can't make adjustments in terms of those teachers working from home, then you certainly can put things in place in which they're not doing talk time, that they would be able to leave the premises because they might feel more comfortable in their own home environment in preparing lessons. So something like that, yeah. So if your neurological function differs from the standard and normal, then you need to accommodate this. This is what Walker states, that the onus is on the individual. And this is kind of juxtaposed to the neurodiversity paradigm, which recognised diversity in minds as healthy and a valuable form of human diversity. There's no normal or right, which I've already described. And it's a new lens in which to view neurodivergent people, to remove the power dynamics created by the pathologising and labelling individuals who don't meet the neuronormative standard. So remember, it's a standard and neuronormative, not that there is an objective normal. So that's important to know. So it's really important to appreciate, and I will put at the end of this PowerPoint, it won't be in the presentation, but it will be on the PowerPoint that you receive, just some references if you'd like to find out more, and also you can contact me direct. So what I want us to do is just start off with an exercise. So you know that you've got some of the foundations to start thinking about the way we really want to approach this if we want to benefit all, and in particular have at the centre of that our neurodivergent workforce. So I want you to consider the following. So this is a scenario that I've made up. So Teresa starts teaching at a local college. This is their second teaching post. They declare to you they're neurodivergent. So they declare to you as their line manager or as their department head or their divisional head or a member of SLT. So you can take this any way. What would you do? I want you to think about, is there a policy in place to accommodate neurodivergent teachers? So that's the first thing you need to think about. And when I say they declared to you that they're neurodivergent, as I said, they may choose to, instead of being pathologised, use that identifier. But they could come to you and say, I'm dyslexic, I'm dyspraxic, I have post-traumatic stress disorder, because that would come under the umbrella of neurodiversity. What would you do? So what reasonable adjustments are reasonable in a teaching environment? Is there a policy in place that could guide you? And how might the college address Teresa's emotional needs, provide practical solutions, any teaching and learning strategy? So I want you to think about this emotional needs in terms of the point I made earlier about the kind of psychological well-being. And more importantly, it's really important when we have policy in place that we appreciate and include that in the round, so that there is policy in place to, to have a kind of structure, almost like a structure of what happens if you are supporting a neurodivergent member of staff. How are you going to be supported in terms of, for example, if you wanted to give them additional time for marking, they asked you if you could do more lesson observations, that sort of thing, or lesson observations. So how might you need, what might what support might you need as Teresa's manager? So I just want you to think about that as we go through this. So maybe you'll just stop now just for a second, and you can pause this, maybe have a go on your college, school, university website and see if you can find a policy. Ask someone in your if there's any kind of supported learning service, you know, what could be done. And really important, firstly, ask Teresa. Ask Teresa if she's declared to you, ask her what would work for her. And this stops us going into that one size fits all mindset. I thought, oh, she said she's dyslexic, I better give her more additional time for marking. That may not be what she wants at all. So giving the full autonomy for the individual to say what they require. So I want you to think about this. So now we've looked at a scenario. So you know that you've got one member of staff as declared. So where are we? And this question is about how many individuals that might identify as neurodivergent in the workplace. So how many do you think there are? There are some statistics gathered. The Education and Training Foundation used to gather statistics, so I don't know if they still gather statistics. There are statistics that are gathered at higher education. I believe membership organisations may gather statistics. Do you think about your school and college and university? Do you gather statistics on this? Do you break it down? Is it in the catch-all term disability? Do you look at neurodivergence as separate? So where are we? Where are the neurodivergent educator workforce? How many of us are out there? Answer, I don't know. Nobody knows. One of the reasons nobody knows is it requires those individuals to declare. So you need to think about why they might not want to. You also need to think about why they should, because they may not want to. Just, in terms of being a teaching professional, this is something that I struggled with. I didn't declare to my first employer until I was 3 years in, and that's because as part of my finishing my postgraduate qualification in further education, I did a small scale dissertation, and the research that was out there by Barbara Ruddock, looking at trainee teachers in the compulsory education who had specific learning differences, that the outcome of that piece of research in 2003 was it would be better that you don't say, because there might be questions of competency, and so it's a real issue. And the education and training workforce data in 2018 2019, 1% of teachers who worked in colleges identified as having a learning difficulty, and just over 2% stated yes rather than not say. So it's really difficult, because the chances are it's much higher than that. So we don't know. This is a really interesting one. So when I was carrying out my PhD research, I interviewed a teacher who stated they had dyslexia, and they said to me that actually one of the difficulties for them is, as an adult, and this is the problem with the language of the biomedical model, having a learning difficulty, a learning difference. Well, difficulty, you learn and then you get over it, don't you? And the fact that we don't have any policy or practice or real recognition of neurodivergent workforce would almost imply that, again, that people grow out of it. And what they said is that it's another thing that they didn't like saying that they had dyslexia because it felt childish. And I thought that was a really interesting sentence that had quite an impact on me, because I thought, yeah, because it's always presented as something that is in your formative years. You don't grow out of it. You don't. It's pervasive. I'm dyslexic. I don't have dyslexia. I can't take it away from me and put it in a box. So yeah, that's really interesting. So you need to think about all of that, all of those things that are going to be in those teachers' heads as well about that. So this is a piece of research. So this isn't particularly looking at, there isn't loads of research in this, but I think it's important to include some. So there isn't loads. This was a piece of research that was carried out by the charity Neurodiversity in Business and in partnership with Birkbeck University. So they carried out this survey in 2023, and they've recently done the same survey this year, and they're about to publish their results. And this was looking at from across the board, so it wasn't specifically in education, but it gives you an indicator going across, and it's very much in line with previous research. So career progression and psychological safety was critical for retention and well-being. And what's really interesting is that that was more important for those individuals than reasonable adjustments. They knowing that they were in an environment in which they were heard, that there were attempts to make it more affirming rather than just accommodating, really made a difference. There was a real request for focus on manager training and equipping frontline managers with the knowledge and confidence to assist in navigating. And certainly that bore true in my own research, but also, yeah, that's something to think about. In my own research, it's always good to do a little plug for yourself. So a lot of the time when I did ask, I spoke to principals, vice principals. I spoke to individuals from representatives from wider, because it was in the FE sector, organisations such as membership organisations. I spoke to a former policy officer for the Department of Education. And just asking about what policy was in place, and there was a real will to support, but what there was too much a reliance on is just cribbing the support that was put in for students, which is not adequate, because you're dealing with professional integrity here. You don't want to go and ask the supported learning staff, whether it's something that could be put in place for you. So we really need to have, rather than just an ad hoc approach, it's really important to show the neurodivergent workforce that their talents are important to their education employer. And also also they were unable to identify how many neurodivergent member of staff they had in their so that's another key. And finally, there was a piece of research back in 2018. This was a really wide-scale piece of research. Westminster Achievability Commission, and found that 73% of 600 respondents, so that's quite a large sample, chose not to disclose to avoid discrimination. So you need to really be thinking about that. Okay, so why a fully neuro-inclusive college works for all? So let's think about this. So there are some structural requirements. So you've got the Equality Act of 2010, where it's a requirement to have positive action. So because we have to have compliance, which is what we should be moved on from that, because before that there was the Disability Discrimination Acts. The last being before the Equality Act, the Disability Discrimination Act of 2005. So we've had a long time to embed compliance, and we should be moving beyond that. But more importantly, cultural change, policy and practice which recognises neurodivergence is not something a person grows out of. That we want to create neuro-inclusive culture for all, because we want to, and that shows a really positive. So if you had an environment, if you had a workspace that when you walk into a communal area in which we were celebrating and recognising neurodivergence amongst staff and students, then that already sets a tone for that, for anyone who walks in there, about it being an inclusive environment. Now, you can't see this very well on the video, but it is in the PowerPoint. So what might that look like? So positive role models for students, celebrating neurodivergent talent in student spaces, promote lifelong achievements. Neurodivergent young people, yeah, they grow into neurodivergent working adults. So it's really important. So I did one example here about where it might be, and it might be in Neurodiversity Week that you have, okay, we've got a celebration for students. And you know, what I find when I've been in schools and colleges is that you'll have these walls dedicated to famous people who are neurodivergent. You've got role models in your workplace. Use those. If you create an inclusive environment, people will be more likely to, if they choose to declare, and you will have these role models at your fingertips that you can celebrate and share. So all of this is a positive, is going to develop a positive culture for your organisation. Really importantly, and I'm not going to do loads on this, but the public sector equality duty, which all organisations that receive public funding in some way are bound by. So you've got the general duty, so put an end to unlawful behaviour, discrimination, harassment and victimisation. Advance equal ops between those that have protected characteristics and those that don't. Foster good relations between those that have protected characteristics and those that don't. So it's really important that we don't create this culture. So if you have a really transparent, inclusive culture, you won't have a situation where someone might go, why is that teacher always able to get their own classroom with ILT and I'm not able to? And that's going to create tension, and that teacher might get that because they've said, could I have that as a reasonable adjustment? Because for me, so I'll give an example, my dyspraxia, I worked in an FE college and I'd be sent all over the building, and if I was particularly stressed or just sometimes, it really affects my orientation. So I was in one college where I was working, I had been there 5 years or so, and I was sent the other side of the building, and for whatever reason that day I just couldn't find my way, completely lost all orientation. I'd been to the room before, and by the time I got there I was 10 minutes late. I was absolutely panicked. The students were mortified that I turned up, and I still get that as an anxiety dream, even though I've actually left teaching. I left teaching to pursue my academic and advocacy work. I still get panic when I'm stressed and I have a stressful dream. It will be me looking for a classroom for 10 minutes. So we need to make sure that when we are putting things in place, if you've got an inclusive environment, people don't question these things and they understand. And complying with the general duty is a legal obligation. That's really important. So it's really important for you to go away and look at your policies and processes and think, are you adhering to the general duty? Because it is a legal obligation for you to do so, and that's not the reason why you should be doing it, but I need to say that. So specific duty, and this varies between the nations. So the information I've got here is for England, but equality information needs to be provided once a year, one or more equality objectives that needs to be specific and measurable, and there needs to be gender pay gap info. So what I found in my experience is that a lot of education employers are particularly good at the specific duty, but need to be more developed in the general duty. So I wanted to put this into practice and get you to think about, okay, so this is what employers must do as Section 20 of the Equality Act. So they need to take reasonable adjustments to alleviate substantial disadvantage, removal of barriers based on individual need. That's the key thing. It really must be based on individual needs, and provision, criteria and practice. That's what it applies to. And PCP, so that could be things like policies, sickness absent policies, disciplinary and grievance, performance management, lesson observation policy, all of that in terms of education. Very important, you need to have that. and that could be including like auxiliary to do with provision. That could be things like auxiliary aids. Sorry, not sorry, auxiliary aids. So that might be things like I said, like do you have the how you have the does your teacher in their staff room, do they have, as I said, have 2 screens? Do they have it set up in a working environment that enables them to feel calm and comfortable? So that sort of thing. And what does a reasonable adjustment look like? Well, there's no definitive list. It really depends on the context, and that's why it's quite important to work with individuals such as myself who understand the context of education, because that will make a big difference in terms of reasonable adjustment. So they're not fixed. So key things to consider: is it reasonable? Will it aid the disabled person to access continual return to employment? Will the reasonable adjustment impact on others? Is it practical? Is it within the employer's resources to provide? Are they able to provide it? So this is something you need to think about. So here's a case study. We're going back to Teresa. Right, so you've already thought about the first thing, so maybe you've got some ideas of what you need to go away and change. This is this case study. Teresa is dyslexic and teaches history to both Key Stage 4 pupils and sixth form students at a local academy. Teresa has disclosed to her school employer her disability. And I use the term disability because that's the protected characteristic under the Equality Act. At the request of the employer, Teresa underwent an occupational health assessment. Teresa has requested additional time of up to 25% marking. Teresa has requested an additional time of up to 25% to complete marking for her A-level mock exams that she set. And normally this is a 2-week window to mark. So she wants 25% extra on top of that. The occupational health assessment supports Teresa's request. The head teacher rejects the request, stating that all students are entitled to receive their mock exam results at the same time. So I want you to think about this. Do you think this is a fair and proportionate decision? So, as part of the Equality Act, there is an additional section 15 of the Equality Act, which offers additional protection for disabled people, and dyslexia would come under that. So it states that it's unlawful to treat a person unfavourably due to their disability. However, unless the employer can justify it as a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. So if this head teacher can justify that the rejection of the 25% is a proportionate means of a legitimate aim, then if this was something that was pursued, went through the grievance process, and then went through all the way through to employment tribunals, so obviously we don't want to be doing that, would it be seen as a proportionate decision? So I want you to think about that. So again, put this on pause, have a think. Do you think this is a proportionate decision? Okay, points to consider. First, there was no definitive answer, but let's go back to the questions. Will the reasonable adjustment assist Teresa to continue with their work? Yes, it will. Will the adjustment impact on the health and safety of others? No. Is it practical? Yes, it's practical. It's within the gift of the employer to be able to grant that. Is it within the school's resources to provide? Yes, they can provide that. They can make the decision to provide that. So let's have a look. Reasonable adjustments that could assist in fulfilling Teresa's request. So these are the things that could have been put in place to fulfill Teresa's request. In the planning of the marking period, factor in extra time for markings cover such requests. During the marking period, suspend additional duties such as detention cover, staff meeting attendance, revision sessions, delivery, after school, college clubs, commitments, playground duties. So there is many ways in which they could address this and provide some sort of reasonable adjustments. So they wouldn't necessarily have to give out and out additional time, but what they could do is suspend all the other things that Teresa would be doing, which would give her back that time. So there are different ways of doing it, so you need to be a bit creative. Outcome. Okay. So an employment tribunal on this basis could decide that this is not proportionate. So it's not proportionate for the head teacher acting as the employer in this case to reject the 25%, because there would have been within their means to do it, and it would have fitted, met all those points to consider. However, this is where it's not set in stone. So if it went through to an employment tribunal, it may possibly could go either way. One of the ways is that it could be argued that it was within their means to make those provisions, because if they couldn't give her the additional time, they could have reduced the time of other things. Yeah. However, what would be seen as a proportionate decision is if this was summative assessment. So maybe this is a formative assessment, it's a mock exam. But if they were doing their actual summative exam and nationally everyone was getting their scripts back on the same day, it would not be seen. It would be upheld and seen as a proportionate decision to not grant additional time. So if it had an impact on a national, in terms of if everyone else was getting their results in the same day, then it would be upheld as potentially upheld as proportionate decision to reject the additional time request. So how this links and why I'm pointing this out in terms of how it benefits all, is that if you have these scenarios and you have a considered approach, it makes such a difference in terms of not only being compliant, but trying to think about things creatively to create a culture that isn't just a kind of that appreciates the difference. And so it's thinking in a broader sense of like, okay, well actually we can't give her additional time, but we could do these other things, because she normally would do playground duty, or she would do after school clubs, or in terms of if it's further education, it might be that there is a department meeting every Monday, everyone has to go to that, or there's an all staff meeting, so they wouldn't necessarily have to do that. So it's thinking about these things creatively. Okay, so to extend this, why fully neuro-inclusive college works for all. These are just some kind of ideas, kind of takeaways for you to maybe go away and put in place straight away. So promoting staff rooms and communal spaces, guidance initiatives in place to accommodate neurodivergent staff. So looking after staff psychological well-being, so have like promotion of this. So you can even have in the staff areas, even information about things like the Access to Work scheme, which is a government initiative in terms of, this is access to work is additional to reasonable adjustments, because reasonable adjustments is part of the legal duty of the Equality Act, but Access to Work scheme may be, may enable the individual to apply for resources and auxiliary aids that are outside what the employer can provide. So that might be things like a tablet, it might be things like you can request for a virtual assistant. So as a teacher, having someone who's doing all the administration, could be something like that. It could be something as well as having access to certain software, which might make a difference in terms of assisting them in teaching and learning preparation. So those sort of things. Where possible, accommodate neurodivergent teachers in the planning of academic timetable. So classroom location, the example I gave you earlier. Access to e-technology. Allocate work based on neurotype strengths. So, I used to be really brilliant at creating content. I loved it, and I was really good at creating. I could do that whole metacognition of being able to look at the small parts and group them all together. So when I was teaching, I would be able to make synoptic links really easy. So, you need, if it's a strengths-based division of labour, it makes such a difference to kind of harness that. Does everyone have to deliver revision sessions? Does everyone have to create so you can just do that division of labour, working to the strengths of your neurodiverse in terms of the population, so that includes everyone. So neurodivergent, if it's an individual, neurodiverse should only be used, that term, when you're talking about a population of everyone, which would also include those that would be described as neurotypical, who process information in a neuronormative way. That's defined as neuronormative by the things that we have in place. Okay, so development enactment of neuro-inclusive policy. Inclusive cross-college protocol will avoid systemic failure. So this is really important. So a member of staff comes to you, you've got reasonable adjustments. I'd like these reasonable adjustments put in place. And then it may be something like some sort of software, and then they inform HR, and then that information is then sent on to IT. There needs to be a kind of almost like flow chart. Who's managing the whole thing? Because in my experience with working with neurodivergent teachers and others, because I've also worked with neurodivergent general practitioners, is the fact that what ends up is that there's some sort of systemic failure in which there'll be blockers where something won't happen, it won't be passed on, and then you have the neurodivergent individual sending 70 emails trying to get something sorted. So we need to have a process. Provide managers with training and time to enact neuro-inclusive practice. So this also can be a request as part of the access to work, that there is training for the organisation to make them so that everyone is on board, and that training should be available to all. Encourage disclosure by making or to declare by making the process easy and transparent. So have good example practices in staff rooms and communal areas. Talk about neurodivergence in staff handbooks. How can we advocate? So this is thinking about what benefits us. Now let's think about each other as colleagues. How can we advocate for our neurodivergent colleagues? So as a college or university, school, be informed of HR policy and process on reasonable adjustments. Consider the language used in relation to neurodivergence. Reframe from a deficit model to a benefit model. Adopt where possible universal design principles to reduce the need for individuals to declare. This will cut back on the need for common reasonable adjustments requests. So you could, the HR in the education comply can potentially look at what are the common reasonable adjustments that have come through. Are there any common ones? Could you then put those things in place as a whole? And then you're just dealing with the individual requirements. But there may be some things, like I said, the double screens is a big one. So having two screens, not double screens, two screens is quite a big one. All policies which focus on terms and conditions of employment and wellbeing should consider intersectionality. That's really important because that makes a big difference. Because for many with neurodivergence, there's going to be situational variability. So now I am a multiply neurodivergent individual who's perimenopausal, and things have shifted for me. It's a massive impact on my focus and my recall more than ever. So it's really important to recognise that. Everyday practice. So limit the request for immediate action. So can you factor in some time? You can't always do that, but there will be opportunities to do that. Be clear with instructions or requests. Bullet point key actions information. A good thing is, if you could label your emails with a request, this is a request, this is something I want you to do, and make that really clear, or an action, you have to do this. Could you send the marking for 1B by end of day on, if possible, you know, those sort of things, but obviously make sure you factor in a lot of time in that. Or is it information? You could say this email is for information. Information, just put info at the top, or action at the top, or request at the top, and then bullet point what it is that you're, so that the individual is in no, doesn't in any way, is unsure about what their message is, and they're able to read it clearly. When booking meetings, leave a gap of at least 30 minutes in between meetings to allow for decompression time, and provide an agenda. And the same with lesson planning. Where that is possible, try not to timetable a heavy day, one day where someone is doing 5 sessions. There needs to be some sort of decompression time. If that's unavoidable, do the next best thing, timetable them in the same classroom, if that is possible to do. Do not make any assumptions. Neurodivergence is often multiple. Someone who's dyslexic and dyspraxic is likely to require different accommodation than someone who's dyslexic and autistic, potentially. So remember, autonomy. Let the individual tell you. Support, how do we advocate for ourselves? So this is why the whole benefit all, I'm doing the kind of in the round. If your diagnosis is in place, refer to workplace policies on equality, equity, diversity, inclusion, reasonable adjustments. Use these to help shape any requests for support and accommodations. Discuss the adjustments you may need. If you're unsure of what you require, reach out to support groups, relevant charities. Role of occupational health. So occupational health can support you in terms of being able to put in requests for access to work. Or if you don't know in the workplace what you might need, you can have an occupational health assessment. Seek support from your union. If you're part of a union, do seek support. There are protections under the Equality Act. Make sure you're familiar with the Equality Act, particularly the protected characteristic disability, but also pay attention to the others if there's an element of intersectionality, which there will be for most people, if not all. Request a reasonable adjustment passport. Reasonable adjustment passport was created by the Trade Union Congress in partnership with GMB, if I remember rightly. This is a really useful tool because it's got a policy and it's got the passport. If you work for a school, the local authority might have their own version of this, so you could speak to your local authority employer and see if they have got their own version of the reasonable adjustment passport. And you can, the good thing about it is it's a record and it's stored centrally, and so you don't have to keep repeating what you need. You can say it's all there, these are my requirements, please refer to that. If you suspect that you may be possibly neurodivergent, it's really important to know that you do not have to be formally diagnosed to benefit from the Access to Work scheme. It does not require you to be diagnosed. In terms of receiving reasonable adjustments, the Act, or ACAS, so the would state that employers should try not to get caught up in requiring proof of disability, to use the protected characteristic term under the Equality Act, or should not be requiring proof of neurodivergence. If you they should not get caught up on that. But it's a bit of a grey area. But in terms of the Access to Work scheme, you certainly don't have to be formally diagnosed. Diagnosed with help with reasonable adjustments. The Equality Act does assume that diagnosis is already in place, So it doesn't say anything really. I haven't found anything, and anyone can, if anyone wants to correct me, then I'll be happy to be corrected, which talks about individuals in terms of the Equality Act with a protected characteristic of disability if they haven't been formally diagnosed. Do not feel pressure to declare. It's not necessary. You shouldn't have to. Challenge your internal ableism. This is the hardest thing, and I have to constantly do this because I'm always, I have to keep challenging that. You know, this idea that not good enough, can't do it. Oh, it's taking me out. I can't recall anything. Challenge that. And that's it. 1 hour, done. If you'd like to find out more, please do reach out to me. So I hope you get an idea. I tried to do a rounded in terms of how it benefits all from a structural and a cultural perspective for an organisation. And the activities are just to get you to think about those things in practice. But ultimately, where we want to get to is a neurodiversity-affirming and inclusive working environment for all. Thank you for listening.